Greetings again from Geneva, and thank you for joining our weekly update on the COVID-19 crisis. It's Tony Consul here, Head of Communications. I'm with Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist, and Alexandre Juniac, our Director General and Chief Executive Officer. As usual, we'll start with a brief presentation by Brian, then a few remarks by Alexandre, and we'll throw it open to questions using the chat function. So if you have any questions, please do input them into the chat function, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we possibly can in the time we have. So with that, Brian, would you like to get us started?
Okay, thank you very much, Tony, and hello, everybody. So the analysis this week is looking at the cargo business, and let me start with the data for March that we have just released, which shows, as you can see, a sharp fall in the levels. These show the seasonally adjusted levels. So over the year to March this year, we've actually seen cargo ton kilometres flown fall by 15.2%. Obviously, as you can see, that's a very steep fall, reflecting the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. But what I would point out is that in the global financial crisis, 2008-2009, we saw a 23% fall. So actually, the cargo business has suffered less in this crisis than it did in the big recession. And I think the second point is that the cargo business is suffering far less than the passenger business at the moment. We haven't released the March data yet for passenger global RPKs, but we've certainly got some estimates based on what we know about passenger flights, which were down 30% in March, and that followed a sort of 14% fall. So there's been a very substantial fall in the passenger business, and cargo has suffered by much less. Now, obviously, the key question is, why is that? And I think there are two reasons. The first is that the cargo business has been essential to fly around the medical supplies. Now, we don't have data on medical equipment shipped, but we do have data from our Cargo IS database on the pharmaceuticals flown. And as you can see here, they have doubled in volume shipped since the beginning of the year. And as you can see, other commodities have fluctuated. Obviously, they've been down. Actually, interestingly, other commodities didn't fall too much for much of this period while the passenger business was collapsing. It's only actually recently, in the last few weeks, where I think we're starting now to see the impact of the recession and the collapse of demand on the cargo business. If we look at how cargo in the air, how air cargo has performed against other transport modes, it's quite an interesting picture, really, because certainly at the start of the crisis in February, there actually seemed to be a switch to surface transport, in particular to rail. As you can see, the international trade all modes is to February, and the same is true for ocean trade. That's to February, whereas the air cargo is through to March. But you can see that both air cargo and ocean trade, containerized ocean trade, suffered about the same. There were big falls in February as a result, whereas the overall international trade was down something like 3% year on year, reflecting other modes taking up the slack, and I think that was mostly rail. That seems to be changing because of the restrictions COVID-19 has placed, particularly on ocean trade. Certainly the anecdotal evidence is that air cargo is now picking up its share of total international trade. It's quite a varied experience across regions. If we look at the year-on-year growth rates, January, February and March, across the regions, you can see actually quite different levels of performance. I think the first point I would note is the China domestic market, where I think we're actually seeing some evidence of the return to work in China, and the increased economic activity being reflected in actually an improvement in the cargo tons shipped within China. I would point out, though, that the Chinese New Year, which was in February rather than in January this year, has distorted the January and February numbers. But I still think that there's some sign there of China returning to work. But if we look at the other regions, it's clear that Europe and Asia, the rest of the Asia-Pacific region, were hit very severely, and Latin America were hit very severely in March. Compared to the previous 2 months, relative to other regions, North America and actually Africa in particular, I think the relatively small decline in Africa is really reflective of the fact that the spread of the virus and the impact on the economy has happened a little bit later in that continent than in others. So that's the interesting regional variation. I think there's some very interesting variation as well between what's happened to the freighter business and what's happened to the cargo carried in the belly holds of passenger aircraft. Because, and these are the March numbers, the year-on-year growth rates of March. And you can see pretty clearly that actually, the freighter business has been doing, is very strong. There's very strong demand for freighters, and freighters have been carrying more cargo in tonnage terms than they were last year, particularly within Asia. So that within Asia numbers up over 42% compared to last year. But as you can see the effect of the grounding of the passenger fleets. So even within Asia, where there's clearly strong demand for cargo to be shipped, we see a 45% fall in the cargo carried in the bellies of passenger aircraft. So there's clearly a very big divergence between the freighters. And normally there's a 50-50 split between cargo carried by freighters, all cargo operations, and in passenger aircraft. And that's a traffic carried. If we look at the capacity, I think it also shows it shows one of the key issues at the moment. We've actually got a bit of a capacity crunch in the cargo business, very much unlike the passenger business. Airlines have managed to increase the utilization of their freighter fleets. So you can see here that in terms of capacity, in terms of available cargo ton kilometres, actually it's up quite sharply in pretty much all the major markets apart from the North Atlantic, where it's down marginally. But within Asia, capacity is actually up by more than 25%, and that's not because of more freighter aircraft. It's because of the increased utilization that's been taking place. Although what I would say is that because of that capacity crunch, airlines are busy trying to use passenger aircraft to carry cargo to address that crunch. You can see this. You can certainly see the impact of the falling capacity more clearly on this industry level picture. The blue line shows the traffic carried, and the last month in March down 15.2% year on year. Cargo, though, is down much more substantially, as you can see. It's gone from growing by 5% or so at the end of last year to between 20 and 25% down in March. The numbers, the exact numbers, are available in the press release, but it's pretty clear from that what we've seen is a much bigger fall in the capacity available because of the grounding of the passenger fleets than the fall in traffic, and that has caused a real squeeze in the market. So the market, because of that, has pushed up cargo rates, which is why you're now seeing airlines converting, using passenger aircraft to the extent they can to carry cargo to respond to that. I guess the question is also, is this situation likely to continue? If you recall in that earlier slide, we've started to see a sharper fall in recent weeks in cargo shipped. And what we've done in this next slide is to take the World Trade Organization's forecasts this year for international trade. So that's trade carried by all modes. And we've assumed, for the sake of these scenarios, that air cargo will sustain its market share. If you recall, in one of the earlier slides, air cargo actually lost share in February. But certainly the anecdotes are that the anecdotal evidence is that air cargo is gaining share at the moment, as it's one of the only modes of transport that's available given the circumstances. But I think it's a reasonable assumption of a stable market share. In that case, we would expect to see, on average in 2020, air cargo falling between 14%, using the WTO's optimistic scenario, and a fall of 31% using their pessimistic scenario. So obviously that would suggest the second half of this year, and perhaps the second half of the second quarter, is going to be a rather different environment than the environment in the first half, which was the first quarter and the first part of the second quarter, where there was a severe shortage of capacity relative to the demand that there was for air cargo. And I think it's, as the recession takes hold and demand from consumers and businesses obviously collapses in that sort of environment, the market situation is likely to change. But the final slide is evidence of the confidence, or otherwise, of the heads of cargo. We've been surveying heads of cargo every 3 months, actually since 2006. And as you can see here, these are the results of the April survey. So we've just completed another survey of the confidence of the cargo businesses, air cargo businesses. And as you can see, clearly confidence is down very significantly, both for expectations of cargo volumes over the next 12 months, but also for yields over the next 12 months. They're down below that line, which shows it's in declining territory. Both yields and volumes expected to fall. But I think it is notable that confidence is not at the moment as bad as it was in the global financial crisis. And recall that first slide, the fall so far has been less than in the global financial crisis. And certainly with anecdotal evidence that air cargo is gaining share, certainly the businesses are not as pessimistic as the forecasts of the World Trade Organization. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. We'll now turn it over to Alexandre to make a few comments before we throw it open to questions.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this briefing. Brian has updated you on the situation of cargo. It's for us the brightest spot because it's the only part that is operating and earning revenue at any scale. But we have three challenges in front of us. First of all, Brian has mentioned capacity. The capacity that has fallen by nearly a quarter, while demand has fallen by 15%. So in the short term, we don't have enough capacity. And so airlines are doing whatever they can to gain this physical capacity, either by taking freighters out of storage or using them more intensely, and they are also adapting passenger planes to all cargo operations. But that's only half the solution, because we are still facing delays and difficulties because governments have not fully sorted out these three main issues. First of all, it takes too long to get the approvals for special or charter operations. Second, some governments are still treating operating crew as they were arriving passengers, even though they don't interact with the local population. So we think that they need, the crew, to be exempted from special quarantine measures. And third, we are still finding it difficult to secure proper facilities to process cargo or to rest the crew. So despite some very significant and supportive plans that have been put together by the Europeans or the Chinese authorities or the Americans to boost and to facilitate cargo, there are still some difficulties that we have to overcome. But it shouldn't take too long. We should get rid of these difficulties, because we play our role as aviation in carrying vital pharmaceuticals to fight the pandemic, and it's impossible to explain that there are still delays, slowing down these type of processes. The second challenge we are facing is the looming recession. The economies around the world, as Brian mentioned, are in bad shape. The recession is there. The good news is that our heads of cargo are, in a way, optimistic. There will be a slowdown due to the economic recession, but they don't expect the downturn to be as bad as it was in the global financial crisis in 2008. So we hope they are right. We will continue anyway, and despite or because of that optimism, to strongly advocate governments to help airlines to facilitate cargo and to implement the financial relief measures, the financial support packages they have announced, and to implement them effectively and quickly. There are 3 points I would like to raise with you that are different from cargo. The first concerns Argentina. The government in Argentina is effectively grounding commercial aviation until September 1st. That is well beyond the current period of lockdown in the country, and will risk additional thousands of jobs connected to the travel and tourism sector. Of course, we do not dispute the government's decision to lock down, but why set an arbitrary date for aviation that is not based on science or aligned with what is being planned for the rest of the economy? So that's our first concern. The second point that I want to raise is the importance of ICAO. It is the global standard setter for aviation. The industry in this crisis needs a cooperation, coordination, and a worldwide approach to restart in the most effective, efficient, and safe way. What has been shut down unilaterally should be reopened in a complete cooperative and collaborative manner. And so we need a strong ICAO to coordinate and this process. In the recent week, we have heard that some states are finding it difficult to meet their funding commitment to ICAO. We understand that the demand on state resources is great, but we encourage states to prioritize keeping ICAO strong, because this industry strongly needs ICAO. And you remember that at least 25 million jobs depend on aviation. So it's a key element to continue and to support ICAO, particularly in this crisis period and also in the recovery period. The third point, that I would like to raise is to announce that we have fixed new dates for the 76th IATA Annual General Meeting. We will do it in Amsterdam from 22nd to 24th of November this year. KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, will be the host. Media are invited, so if you be kind enough to mark your calendars, of course, every precautions will be taken to preserve and to maintain safety and health and everything that we are used to or we will have to do following the COVID-19. We considered all the options, including virtual formats, but in the end, we thought it was important to demonstrate the resilience of aviation and the importance of meeting in person. For sure, there will be much to discuss, and we expect that you will be very numerous to join. With that, I'm very happy to take your questions with Brian.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandre. We have a few questions in the queue. So the first question is about hygiene measures. And it says that we're seeing some individual airlines announce new hygiene safety rules, for example, requiring passengers or crew to wear masks. What is the status of industry-wide hygiene standards?
What we are doing is we are working both with WHO, ICAO, our industry partners within the ICAO, the new ICAO task force. And one of the first priority we will put on the table is to design and to implement a common health, safety, sanitary control measures for passengers in the airport and, of course, on board. So that's we have something ready, and we will discuss that in this format. We will also approach several governments with this proposal to see how they consider implementing this single system that is absolutely key for the restart of our industry. So it is something we are working on, and we have a pretty strong proposal to put on the table to be applicable everywhere in the world.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question on China, and it's asking, with the upcoming major holiday in China, how do we see developments in the domestic market?
Do you want me to take that, Alexandre?
Please, Brian.
Yeah. Certainly the Chinese passenger market has been interesting since we've seen the initial return to work, followed by a plateauing of passenger numbers. And I think the upcoming holiday season is going to be an important test of the strength of leisure demands and China's return to work, perhaps not to play, to put it in that way. And I think this is going to be an important guide to confidence and a guide to other markets too.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about Brazil. Is the Brazilian government taking too long to release the cash it promised? It's been weeks since the negotiations started and no money up till now. What can companies do?
We are urging all governments around this planet, to implement the plan they have announced, and especially, to release the cash that the aviation sector desperately needs. So it's true for Brazil as well. Now that plans have been announced, we need the cash in our balance sheet and in our P&L, because the main financial issue, and we are facing in the very short run, is to run out of cash. So in Brazil, as in many countries, the airlines, and our industry partners desperately need the cash that has been promised by governments.
Okay. We have a question about cargo. Will the cargo demand the bigger demand for cargo operations stabilize the market and help the freighter airlines to survive, or is consolidation inevitable?
Well, I think the freighter airlines are certainly in a very, they're in a much stronger position than anybody else. I think their services have been in extreme demand, as we've seen with the growth figures. Freight utilization is up tremendously. Airlines are converting passenger aircraft, using passenger aircraft to carry cargo. So, all cargo operations are in actually pretty good shape at the moment. It just shows how important air transport is to connect the world at times like this and in regular times to maintain supply chains. Again, I think a test is going to be the second half of this year and the impact of the recession, because I think that's going to be a rather more difficult time.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have another question about cargo. IATA has been suggesting that governments need to do three things, including facilitating cargo operations and the efficient movement of crew through facilitation processes. Have all governments responded to that, or are there some particular regulators or governments that we're concerned about that haven't made those allowances?
Some governments have clearly responded to that by putting together plans to facilitate cargo on many areas, paperwork, logistics, crew treatment, and all that stuff. But there are some areas and some airports or countries in which we are still facing some difficulties, and that's the signal we wanted to send today to these governments, is to lift the obstacles or the difficulties that are still existing in some areas of the world. Not everywhere, but in some areas.
We have a question about Spain. The government of Spain has not given direct help to its airlines as the governments of France and the Netherlands have. Considering the size of the air transport industry in Spain and the fact that it's been tremendously affected by this, does IATA have any comment?
Yes. The government of Spain, as 93 or 94 other governments of this planet, have been very strongly lobbied by IATA and the airline industry, to support the industry. So now it's a political and economic decisions that are in the hands of government. But we have asked every government and the Spanish as well, to support its industry, because we think it's absolutely key for this industry to survive, and especially in Spain, in which the air connectivity is absolutely key. So we urge the Spanish government to do something. It's in their hands.
Okay. We have a question about airline bankruptcies. It says, do you believe that there will be more bankruptcies in the aviation industry, and will they happen in particular segments of the industry?
Brian, do you want to
yes, sure.
Okay.
I mean, we have seen bankruptcies already. We have seen a number of airlines failing because of the rate at which they're having to burn up capital with no revenue, fixed costs, and other demands on their cash. So we have seen some. Now, clearly, governments are stepping in and providing substantial support, but we still see the situation is extremely fragile, particularly as the recession starts to take its toll. We have seen cargo as a bit of a lifeline in the first part of the year. I think in the second part of the year that's going to be, or the second and third quarter, it's going to be rather different. So we still see problems ahead. We're not out of this situation yet at all, and airline finances are extraordinarily fragile at the moment. The airlines had, on average, 2 months' worth of cash at the beginning of this year, and many have burnt that up in their unavoidable costs already.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question here, and I think probably need to make a clarification. The question says, with reference to Alexandre's comments on ICAO, are we not satisfied essentially with the job that they're doing? And what specifically would we want them to do more of? Alexandre, I think your comments referred more to making sure that governments will provide ICAO with the funding that they need in order to continue doing the work that they do. But Alexandre, please, can you comment?
My comment is not against ICAO. On the contrary, we need ICAO, to be particularly effective and efficient in this crisis period, either to overcome the crisis, but also for the recovery period. It's absolutely key because we need this institution that coordinate and all the states and in which they can collaborate and cooperate. So we need ICAO, and but we point out that it is not the appropriate time for some states not to release the funds they have promised to ICAO, because it would weaken ICAO in the worst possible period. So we are asking the states who have not released the promised fund to do it, to support ICAO.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Denmark, I suppose. In Denmark this morning, we got the news that SAS is dismissing 5,000 employees across Scandinavia. It's important that governments help companies financially. Is it important that governments help companies get through this crisis? And why? What's in it for governments?
I missed the question. Just the question. Is it important for what? For government to do what?
Yes. Why is it important for governments to do this? What do governments gain by providing financial support to the airline industry?
We think that the airline industry is absolutely key for the economic development. It is key for very big and very important sectors of the economy. Let's just mention tourism, which account for 10% of the GDP in the world, and it's important for 25 million jobs and hundreds of thousands of jobs in Scandinavia. It's to have a strong airline sector will be absolutely key if we want the recovery to be fast and strong. So that's enough reasons to encourage government to support this industry, which is absolutely key for their economy in the Nordic as in Scandinavia as it is in all parts of the world.
Yeah, and just to illustrate the size of that potential impact, about 65 million jobs or so depend upon aviation worldwide, and our analysis a few weeks ago showed that about 25 million of those are at risk in the current crisis. So there is, as Alexandre said, a very urgent need there. We have a question now about details of practices we might see in air travel in a post-COVID world. Alexandre, are there any practices first that you see now that we would like not to be happening, or do you see some processes or requirements coming into the post-COVID world that would enable the industry to restart?
As you know, our first priority is the safety of our passengers. It's not only air safety, but also health safety, which is a contribution. It's also a priority for us, to collaborate with government to avoid, the pandemic to spread all over the world again through air transport. But on the other hand, we would like the operations and the economics of our industry, to remain viable. And so we have tried to build processes, particularly for health control and sanitary control of passengers, that are maintaining and preserving safety, and at the same time are not damaging, the basic economics and financials of our industry. And that is what we are building and discussing with governments or with ICAO and WHO these days to restart this industry in a way that is economically manageable and positive. It's useless, to build process that would lead the airlines not to operate, their flights because it's economically impossible.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre.
But we will find the right compromise. We are on it. We have solutions.
Okay. We have a question that digs a little bit deeper into that same thought. What would happen if countries or airlines cannot agree on common standards to travel post COVID-19?
But it would, first of all, either complexify the situation for the transporter, for the air transporter, for the carrier. Even it can go up to something that would deter passengers to fly because they could be, for instance, afraid of being put in quarantine in the arrival airport for something they are not ready or able to manage. And it can also increase significantly costs for airlines if the processes are different from country A to country B. And as usual in our industry, when processes are not harmonized, it's an enormous source of complexity, additional cost, and limitation of activity. It's always detrimental to everybody, to the passenger first, to the activity, and to the airlines second.
Okay. We have a question on a potential measure that a country is considering. It's the UK, where there were press reports over the weekend that there would be an introduction of 2 weeks quarantine for people flying into the country. Is this the kind of uncoordinated measure that we're concerned about, and what do you think the impact of this would be?
If you impose a quarantine to every passenger flying in, I think you will see a very, very small number of passengers flying in. So it's an effective measure to deter everybody to go to the UK. Who is willing to be put 2 weeks in quarantine in traveling anywhere? It's really strange, huh?
Okay. We have a question that changes pace a little bit. It's asking about our environmental commitments. How can airlines meet the demands for accelerating CO2 reductions after the crisis, particularly when we see some governments, as in France, imposing certain requirements as a condition of the bailout package?
We have said already two things. First of all, this crisis is not, has never been a cause for airlines to not to stick to their environment commitment. We will continue to and will maintain our commitment at the same level as they were, and they are already pretty ambitious. But we do not change this commitment, and we will stick to them. Secondly, we think that it's not a good idea to pile up conditions on the bailout plan. We are fighting for survival. Our situation is for some of us, almost desperate, economically speaking. So adding further additional conditions, constraints is not helpful, to be polite, and probably totally meaningless.
Okay. We have a question about Africa. And in light of developments at South African Airways, Air Mauritius going into administration, how do you see the air transport industry in Africa post-COVID?
We see it strongly damaged because many big carriers or prestigious carriers are in a very bad shape. So the reason why we have also urged African government to help the industry, but also international institutions to put together rescue packages for the air transport. The African Development Bank, African Union, international organization, development agencies, to help the African airline industry. For the moment, the situation is a bit difficult, and the sector will probably shrink.
Okay, thank you. We have a question for Brian. Brian, in one of your slides, which was entitled China Return to Work Visible in Domestic Improvement, it seems like China's drop in cargo ton kilometers flown is much larger than in other regions, even though the country recovered earlier than other parts of the world from the COVID crisis. Could you elaborate on this part, and what are the reasons for the bigger drop in China's domestic market?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I think essentially it's because China is still the world's manufacturing centre, and that's the key thing that drives air cargo, so we've seen such a substantial fall because of that. But it's recovering. I mean, the numbers are still very negative compared to where they were a year ago, and that's because economic activity, hasn't picked up yet. I mean, we saw in the first quarter the Chinese GDP growth fell. I think it was more than 6% for the first time for decades. But it's coming back, and in those less negative numbers, I think there's some evidence that that's giving a boost, albeit a minor one, to air cargo within China.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have another question on cargo. Will cargo demand eventually decline as the pandemic starts to slow? In that case, do airlines need to be careful about ramping up capacity and freighter modifications now? Could they be left with surplus stock or equipment in the future?
Let me just very briefly tackle that. I think at the moment we do have a severe crisis, a capacity shortage in the cargo sector, and it does seem as though air cargo is one of the few remaining modes of transport. Certainly, ocean transport seems to be affected much more severely. And so it seems as if shippers are turning to air cargo in the absence of other modes, which is perhaps providing some offset to the dampening effect of the recession, at least in these initial months. So certainly not at the moment. So at the moment, I think there's certainly a need for cargo capacity. In the longer term, I guess it depends really firstly on the strength of the economic recovery, and secondly on whether companies will decide to change their global supply chains and perhaps bring capacity closer to home. I guess on both of those factors, it suggests that in the longer term, there might be some weakening, which probably affect all modes of transport as well as air cargo.
Okay, Brian, you said that the sea shippers are more severely impacted than airlines. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yes. So we saw in February a similar fall in containerized ocean shipping to the fall in air cargo. We don't have the March data globally, but certainly for some of the ports data, we've seen things like 30% falls in throughput at some of the major trading ports, which is more severe than the decline that we've seen in air cargo. As I say, it seems that the shipping operations have suffered much more than air cargo.
Okay. We have a question now on Argentina. Are there any additional comments regarding the Argentine government's announcement to restrict commercial flights until September? How will this impact the industry? Is there fear that this could be imitated by other states?
No, you have no additional impact. We think that the decision is disproportionate and shouldn't be imitated by anybody. We have no information that it could be imitated by anyone up to now.
Okay. And we hope it stays that way. We have another question about new measures. How soon or on what type of schedule do you think we'll find new practices being adopted by airlines?
New practices of what? Sorry,
I'm assuming that's with respect to preventing the spread of COVID-19 by air transport?
They should be adopted, the sooner the better, because these practices and these processes are a key enabler, or a key to unlock the travel restrictions and the border closure.
Okay. You've talked a lot about governments and their need to coordinate, but are you also concerned about what's going on within the industry? So some airports are conducting very severe checks, like Hong Kong, or not, as is the case at Heathrow. Some airlines are blocking middle seats, others are not. In Asia, in some cases, we see hazmat suits being worn by crew, etc. Do you see? How do you see the industry coping with this?
The industry is trying to do whatever they can, to restart, but and implementing, and testing some processes and some measures that could be different from one airport to another, from one airline to another. It is the beginning, but it should converge with something which is harmonized and unique and similar in every airport, every country, and for every airline, to avoid the complexity I was mentioning before. And I think it will be done if we are able to convince government and ICAO to implement a single set of measures, and then the sector and all the components of the sector will align with that.
Great, thank you very much. We have a follow-up question on the bankruptcy question. I think we misinterpreted it a little bit. When the question talked about what other segments, or what are the more vulnerable segments of the airline industry, it was referring more to, do we see airports, airlines, ground service providers being more vulnerable to bankruptcies, or do we see other parts of the sector facing more pressure at this time?
Perhaps I could just jump in there. I think that the airline sector is, despite the improvements of recent years, is actually probably the most fragile sector in the value chain. If you look at profitability or return on capital, despite the improvements in the last few years, the airlines are the weakest sector in the value chain, and certainly in terms of balance sheets, which is particularly important at times like this. It's really important, the amount of cash and borrowing capacity that you have, and other players in the value chain, airports, a lot more investment grade airports than there are airlines. So what we do need is to protect the whole air transport supply chain in order to get the recovery that we need. But if you're looking comparatively, I think airlines are still, unfortunately, the weakest part.
Okay. We have a question referring specifically to Ethiopia, but there's also an industry dimension to it. So what is the status of Ethiopian Airlines, and how has it been affected by COVID-19? More broadly, what measures are they taking to avoid COVID-19 that other African carriers have been unable to meet since they're still flying to China to date? So I suppose it's asking what's happening in the African continent with respect to measures that they're taking, and how can they maintain connectivity to other continents, including China?
But is it specifically directed to Ethiopian or to Ethiopia or Africa?
It's specifically to Ethiopian, but I think we probably don't have the information on that airline in particular, but maybe in the context of African aviation.
But we have already answered on the African aviation houses.
Yeah, maybe Alexandre, you could talk about the summit that we had with the African industry and some of the outcomes from that.
We had, as you know, we have organized a regional summit in each part of the world, and particularly in Africa. So the main African airlines were there, plus the governments and civil aviation authorities. Everybody agreed that the situation was very, very difficult, that there was a strong need for financial support plans, of course, and we fully agree with that, and we have lobbied governments, and as I told you, international institutions, multilateral institutions to put together financial support packages. We are a bit worried because of the financial strength of the airline sector in Africa is pretty weak in terms of balance sheet and profitability, so they are heavily exposed to the crisis. It explains why previously I said that the industry in Africa should probably shrink. And so it's not totally different from the rest of the world in terms of the need for cash, the need for financial support, as we see everywhere.
Okay. We have a question about Norwegian Air Shuttle, which yesterday announced that it expected to stay grounded for 12 months in the best case scenario. When does IATA expect flights to start up again, for example, in Europe? And what about in longer haul destinations? And do we see, how do you see the decision of Norwegian Air Shuttle?
In Europe, flights should begin to come back by the end of second quarter. They should restart slowly by the end of second quarter and accelerate at the third quarter, but we will never find the previous level before a long time.
Okay. We have a question on a comment you made last week. You said that the era of low-cost travel could be over. Was that specifically with respect to social distancing potentially being imposed in the cabin? And do you see that then not happening if a vaccine is found? Or are there other reasons why you said that you think the era of low-cost travel might be over?
No, the main reason is if we impose measures that are disrupting operations, increasing significantly our costs, it would be more difficult for it will be impossible or very difficult to have an industry that is able to provide cheap flights serving many destinations. So that the reason why we are trying to propose measures that guarantee, health control and health safety, and at the same time do not increase costs or disrupt operations in a way that is incompatible with low fares.
Okay. Two last questions. First of those concerns the Chinese market. It says that there are reports that Chinese airlines have resumed international flights, but it seems like these are more not very frequent and certainly not of the previous scale. How do you see Chinese airlines' international route recovery? Are they recovering better in April than in March?
They are recovering very, very slowly. The recovery of international flight is very, very slow, even and particularly from China.
Okay. Then a couple of more questions. One is it too early to say that the airline's profitable summer season is not going to happen this year?
The airline what?
Profitable summer season. Should we give up hope for having profits over the summer season?
Excuse me, I didn't understand.
So normally people say that the airlines make the summer season is very profitable for airlines. Is it too early to declare that it's a wash this year, or do you think there's still hope for a potential recovery by summer?
No, nobody is betting on a significant recovery. The operations will restart again, but no recovery at a decent level. No.
Okay. And then the last question is, in the regional summits that happened last week, how would you describe the level of engagement and cooperation between governments, regulators, and the industry?
Very strong. Strong commitment, strong engagement from all partners around the tables.
Okay. And the second part of that question is, when there are competing strategies and solutions on the table, how do you determine who should take the lead or which one to adopt? So I suppose it's the question of how do we take the results of the summits that we had, where we were listening to a lot of proposals from governments and putting our own on the table, is what's the process going forward, Alexandre?
The process is that the state will have to work within the international framework that exists, so mainly ICAO, using WHO or on a regional or continental basis, and they will have to agree this type of process, and we'll try to incentivize, to push, to coordinate, to be to take a kind of, if I may, a leadership in coordinating and showing and paving the way.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're pretty much at time. I make it at 3 o'clock Geneva time. So thank you again to all who participated in this call.